Fafo for the invitation as well. I'd like to pick up really on where Jenny has left off in the focus on trust, or the deficit of trust in brands, at a fairly catastrophic level in global supply chains. But to take a step back with the workers, talking about precarious work, of how the workers actually get to those factories or to their workplace in the first place, and what are some of the vulnerabilities that they're facing before they even start that job. So with those garment factories in Bangladesh, those will almost entirely be Bangladeshi workers, but many of them internal migrants from rural to urban areas. But let me just take you on a journey looking at migrant workers still, but international migrant workers and the vulnerabilities that they're facing, and then looking at what some of the leading brands are doing in terms of addressing their vulnerability to exploitation before they even take up their job. So if we could start in a small village in rural Nepal, high levels of poverty, very few job opportunities, significant numbers of the young men in that village looking for work elsewhere, and one of the main opportunities for work overseas to be earning higher wages than anything they could be earning locally or even in the cities in Nepal would be the construction sector. And there is a well-trodden migration corridor route from Nepal to countries like Qatar and UAE for construction. And so let's focus, for example, on construction for the World Cup stadia, Qatar 2022, that we've all heard a lot about. So that worker, to get to Kathmandu to the point where they can present themselves or are introduced to an international recruitment agency that has got an order for 100 Nepali workers to go and work on a site in Doha on one of the World Cup stadia, will have gone through several levels of sort of introduction to a second cousin's mate who has a local recruitment agency, and so on to Kathmandu. By the time they get to that recruitment agency in Kathmandu, they will already have paid several $100s worth of recruitment fees, facilitation payments, call it what you will. Without paying those fees along the way, there's no way they will get to that recruitment agency that's got the contract for the workers. By the time they're at that recruitment agency, that's when the big recruitment fees kick in. And that's where you find that a number of these workers, the vast majority of them, by the time they actually arrive on the construction site in Qatar, will have accrued anywhere between $2,000 and $6,000 worth of debt, which exceeds their annual salary very considerably. It will take that worker, on average, 3 years to pay back the debt, with the interest rates that are charged on that. So you have a system where there is bonded labour and forced labour on a massive scale going into certain industries. The construction sector is one this is particularly prevalent. The apparel sector is another. Fishing. We've all read about the appalling conditions on Thai fishing boats, for example. A lot of Bangladeshi and Burmese workers on the fishing boats. So linking it back to the video at the beginning, the consumer awareness is growing in some sectors where there's a consumer-facing product at the end of it. So the T-shirts that we're wearing, consumers are asking, can I really be buying this for $5? Did anyone even get paid to make it? And that tiny percentage of labour is what we're seeing across this low end of the market. With the shrimps we're buying in the supermarket, not here in Norway, you're lucky, but elsewhere, you know, by and large, there is now an awareness. What's the modern slavery footprint on this product? With the mobile phones, the electronics, a lot of workers going from South Asia into Malaysia to the electronics sector. Again, very few parts of the global supply chain where this issue of forced labour and human trafficking is not a material business risk. Not to mention the enormous vulnerability to human rights exploitation that there is. So what can companies do? Jenny showed us that the audits weren't catching the issues in the factories, and a lot of that was in front of their eyes to some extent in terms of fire and health and safety. When it comes to recruitment fees that workers have paid, the audits absolutely have not been catching that. And where you haven't got proper union representation or channels of communication for workers to voice grievances or to be asked even the right questions, you've got a situation where this endemic situation of bonded labour because of recruitment fees workers are paying has gone unnoticed for a considerable length of time. So there are a number of leading global companies that are addressing this. It's across industries, but it's really the electronics sector that's been out in front on this. And as ever, it's often when there's been an exposure in the media that's often the greatest catalyst for action on this. But we, at the Institute for Human Rights and Business, our route into this, we developed about 5 years ago something called the Dakar Principles for Migration with Development that follows the route of a migrant worker all the way round from recruitment through the employment phase that Jenny has addressed, sort of back to either return home or onward employment at the end of that contract. So we've been focusing a lot over the last couple of years on the recruitment phase of this and looking at which companies have got any policies, actual policy commitments, and written into contracts with their suppliers, addressing this question of fees charged to workers. Because for us, it is the single most important issue for companies to be tackling bonded labour and forced labour in their supply chains, is to move towards a position where they're eradicating workers being charged fees to secure their jobs. So what we're promoting is something called the employer pays principle. It's an absolute no-brainer, and it's very straightforward. It's not easy to implement in the complexity of these supply chains that we know exist. But it is essentially that no worker should pay for a job, and that the costs of recruitment be borne by the employer. So there are about a dozen, not very much more than that, leading global companies that have an explicit policy commitment on that. So we're working with the likes of IKEA, Unilever, Marks and Spencer, Hewlett-Packard, HP, Coca-Cola, on the call to action to other companies within their industry and across industries to be saying this is something we have to take collective action on. So it's interesting, Jenny, again, talking about ACT and this question of business leadership, but businesses having to act collaboratively on this. This is not about competitive advantage. This is about raising standards across industries. But there is a cost to it, because although that Nepali worker could have ended up paying up to $6,000 for their job on a construction site in Qatar, the true costs of that passage to get the worker from their home country to their site of work, it's passport processing, it's health, it's jabs, it's health insurance, it's a plane ticket. It's almost always well under $1,000. It's depending on where it is. It's in the region of $500 on average. So you can see this massive disparity: the $500 true cost and the $6,000 that workers are being paid, and that's all profit that's being taken by the recruitment agencies. So what we're looking at is a sort of triangular approach to this, which is how can we, with these leading companies, increase the demand for ethically sourced labour? how can we be encouraging other companies to be adopting policy commitments to say we will work to the employer pays principle and we will work to eradicate fees in our tier one suppliers and then beyond? Because it's very interesting. The due diligence that companies will do on commodities and products in their supply chain extends far deeper down the supply chain than any due diligence that they will do in terms of how any workers in their supply chain are recruited. So an apparel company may well know which cotton fields in Uzbekistan the raw cotton comes from, but not how the worker who's in their factory was recruited. So we have to shine the spotlight more on that labor supply chain. So that's boosting the demand, and there are companies who are individually doing it. There are also some of those companies, so Unilever, Coke, Mars, Tesco, have all been working hard within the Consumer Goods Forum, their industry body, to adopt a new set of pillars which are about forced labour, and essentially they're about recruitment fees and retention of passports, which of course is the other facet of this whole forced labour scenario that we see. So individually and collectively, companies can, and a tiny minority, are beginning to act on this. But what we're finding when we talk to companies is, okay, supposing we shift to this, supposing we put it into our contracts with our suppliers, but we also, and we come up with some agreement around the cost sharing of this, the burden sharing. There will be a cost to companies to shift to this model. Where do we find the ethically recruited labour? Where are these recruitment brokers who are providing fee-free recruitment? And at the moment, that is a tiny, tiny industry, and that needs to grow commensurate with the demand that increases for ethical labour. So there are a few initiatives that are starting to invest, social venture capitalists who are starting to invest in the growth of ethically recruited labour. And the third part, just to finish with, is the advocacy with government in sending and receiving countries, because absolutely critical to all of this, and it's back to trust, is proper regulation of the recruitment industry and proper licensing of recruitment agencies, so that brands who have made this commitment can be putting into contracts with suppliers saying, you are required only to recruit workers from here's a list of licensed recruitment agencies. And if we can sort of get those three sides of the triangle somewhat in balance and moving forward together, then I think we can start to see some scale and impact on tackling this question of forced labour in supply chains. Thank you.